contention that the metaphor of war is one which is productive of ways of thinking and ways of acting that contribute fruitfully to the pursuit of the ends of the project of the Christian Liberal Arts University. Like other metaphors for teaching or for other ways of forming this distinctive intellectual and spiritual community called a university, the metaphor of war, with the images it conjures and the languages it evokes, will create avenues of action to be taken or avoided, whether in the classroom, in meetings with students or faculty, and in the myriad ad hoc encounters and activities that go on across the campus, as well as beyond its spatial and conceptual boundaries. Metaphors shape the ways in which we see ourselves and others, the options we see as viable when faced with decisions, the determination of which decisions are of critical import, the tone and posture with which we see fit to approach problems of a moral, epistemological, or spiritual nature, the growth of knowledge within and outside our disciplines, the others whom we encounter and the nature of the relationships we may seek to foster, and the ends we deem worth striving after in fulfillment of what we formulate to be the good life. We organize our lives and articulate knowledge in deeply metaphorical ways. Even if we are at first put off by the metaphor of war, we may have inadvertently found ourselves using it to speak about our task as teachers, as a quick review of examples demonstrates. I actually have a half a page here. I'm just going to pick a few. We can render an argument unassailable. Our position can be undermined. Our methods can be attacked, besieged, assaulted. We can shoot down poorly argued interpretations. We can see the students or the administration as the enemy. And we can arm ourselves against their bad ideas. We can capture the imagination of our students. We can take command as teachers or defuse potential conflict or hostile situations. We develop a strategy of teaching and adopt various tactics to achieve our goals and gain ground. I'm just going to stop there. There's drills of students and things. This language and the way it structures our experiences and lives might quickly lead us into unhealthy ways of relating to our students and to the broader task of being teachers. For instance, one high school teacher declared in a blog that teaching is war, and went on to describe his students as the enemy, and made it his priority to develop strategies of containment and make preventative strikes against the covert operation of insidious students. In spite of the blog then ends after about a couple months. I don't know what happened to the teacher. In spite of the fact that such a metaphoric construal of teaching may resonate with at least some of our experiences in the classroom, most will recognize the ultimately unhealthy and unfruitful consequences of this way of thinking. Likewise, it is doubtful that Jesus, the master teacher, saw his students as the enemy, in spite of calling one of them Satan and telling him to get behind him. He otherwise probably did. In addition, as Christian teachers, we may recall the Apostle Paul's powerful declaration that, though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This is 2 Corinthians 10. But if our students are not the enemy, then who is? And where is the battlefield on which the war is to be fought? And if our weapons are not preemptive strikes against students, then what are the weapons of our warfare as Christians and as teachers? How should we go about formulating strategies? How should we deploy tactics? These are difficult questions, and their answers are no doubt complex. If I were to propose a very summary answer whose details would need a good deal of working out, as I've already elaborated, I would suggest that the enemy is not found in any single group of persons or institution or social force, but rather is the sin nature that corrupts and corrodes people, institutions, and cultures. The battlefield is therefore anywhere that sin's deleterious effects are felt. The enemy to be attacked shows itself in the lethargy of students who feel entitled to a college education and act upon a host of bad ideas of what Christianity is about and what the university is for. The enemy lies in the cultural priorities of convenience and narcissism that so deeply shape our students and ourselves in ways we often fail to detect. The enemy lies in the career-oriented functionalist priorities of parents, understandable though these priorities may be. The enemy lurks behind the anxieties of influence and worries of comparison, that often drive all of us as faculty, students, parents, and administration to pursue false visions of success and forget who we are and whose we are. In all of this, the weapons will be manifold: lectures, seminars, conversations, correspondence, research, writing, worship, prayer, and hours of quiet reflection, hours which are often snatched from us once the semester begins. At a very fundamental level, I would suggest that the determination of the precise ways the war should be fought and the efforts of identifying and targeting the enemy can only be pursued adequately once we have articulated the end goal, or the telos in Greek, of the Christian university and the virtues requisite for achieving that end. In this sense, a lot of what we do as teachers must be conceived as developing and training in intellectual as well as moral and spiritual virtues. That is, I'm using virtues concretely with connection to Greek aratai, that is, particular ways of being excellent. Too often, universities tell their faculty and students to, quote, aim for excellence, without substantively articulating their end goal, and hence leaving the term excellence rather vacuous as a mere rhetorical flourish, so we all pat ourselves on the back. Usually this sort of vague gesturing at nothing in particular is closely aligned with giving a, quote, quality education. This is before I found out what QEP stood for. I'm still going to read it anyway. This is often closely aligned with giving a quality education, which presumes that education is a product being sold. This market metaphor is predicated upon the false presupposition that a consumer model is an appropriate way of conceiving of the twin activities of teaching and learning. Such a consumer model must always avoid specifying concretely the particular excellences that are requisite for achieving a particular end, because the priority is customer satisfaction, which is an ever fickle and moving target. While universities across America may be unclear about their ultimate telos, a Christian university that claims with Augustine in Confessions Book 1 that its final telos is to use all knowledge and all intellectual skills to the glory of God, then a central task is that of developing a robust account of the intellectual and moral virtues, the excellences, that will move us most effectively toward that end. Whereas the market metaphor presumes that education is a product, a certain amount of information or skill sets worth a certain amount of money and signified by a receipt, namely a piece of paper received on a stage at commencement, Christian universities must see the transfer of information as integrally embodied within processes of formation of character, intellectual, spiritual, relational, moral, and so on, along with the virtues proper to their end goal. The adoption of the war metaphor is so significant not only because it displaces misleading metaphors like the market metaphor, but it reminds us of the ways in which the clarity of our vision of the telos and task of teaching at a Christian university are ever being contested, that conceptual ground is too often ceded, that confusion in what we do and who we are result in loss and wounds of a lasting nature. It reminds us that without proper training in the excellences distinctive of a Christian university, battles will be lost and our telos will go unfulfilled or even forgotten. Just as effective soldiers do not battle and merely, quote, do what comes naturally, but draw upon a deep reservoir of skills, strength, and incisive vision from long periods of training, so too we recognize that while we and our students may possess many admirable natural gifts, our ultimate aims are too high and too important to be left only to doing what comes naturally. You don't see tennis coaches telling their players to swing as naturally as they feel. They get tennis elbow. Right? And this is true of all learning. Then John Milton's claim that education must be to undo the effects of the fall. Our education must aim at unlearning the unhealthy habits of thinking and living, the tangled ways in which our nature has fallen, and learn, among a people whom God is redeeming for himself, faithful habits, the practice of which leads to the inculcation of virtues, which in turn lead towards the fulfillment of our telos. Failure to train in intellectual virtues like rigor, precision, control, humility, attentiveness, patience, and commitment, and there are, I think, others if we were to think long and hard about it, will not only result, failure to work on those, will not only result in malformed students who seek to practice medicine, law, literature, business, ministry, etc. It will cost us the very end goal of being a Christian university. let me offer some concrete reflections on one intellectual virtue, namely attentiveness or concentration. Though such a virtue may express itself variously in different activities and within different disciplines across the university, its identification as a particular form of excellence that contributes to the end of a single project or inquiry, as well as the higher ends of the university as an institution and community, seem obvious. In my field of classics and the reading of ancient literature, from Homer's Iliad to Augustine's Confessions, if a student's learning is to move beyond the mere gaining of an impression of an ancient way of life very foreign from our own, or just an impression of an ancient literary form very different from those preferred by modern students, or just an impression of the historical importance of a poem within a once great culture, then I, as the teacher, must be alert to the means of developing habits of reading closely, even slowly, in order to foster the virtue of attentiveness. St. Jerome called this the art of, quote, reading thickly, trebrius lega, which allowed one to learn as much as possible. Whether the form, and by the way, let me just say this is in a letter to a woman, just to give, anyway. Whether the form, it's just interesting what Christians do to education in antiquity. Whether the form is lecture or dialogue, if thick reading is to be performed and attentiveness fostered, then those elements that divert attention or allow poor habits to persist must be avoided. When I am told that the average student's attention span is less than 5 minutes, or that students are now more comfortable in a learning environment that uses technological devices, or that it is more convenient for many students to learn on their own apart from communities that sustain healthy formation, my response must not be how I can change teaching to meet their expectations or desires, or what means I have at my disposal to make my teaching more popular, or begin comparing myself and my teaching at Lee University with what they do at other universities who have adopted a market model of education. I must make war and take captive these thoughts. Instead, we must see such information about the average student as a pedagogical challenge and ask how we might begin helping the student unlearn the habits of inattentiveness with its priority of convenience and learn instead to practice for the virtue of attentiveness with its priorities of rigor, intelligence, and concentration. If we invest ourselves in this struggle, we will gain, with God's help, the formation of a student who embodies the intellectual virtues and who is skilled in a given field. But most importantly, we will nurture and train someone who approaches God. As Simone Weil remarked, attentiveness matters so much in a Christian conception of education because, quote, prayer consists of attention. It is the orientation of all the attention of which the soul is capable toward God, end quote. Attentiveness to small details in the text of Homer, or a musical score of Cézanne, or a cell under a microscope slide, or the parsing of Trinitarian formulations in a medieval theologian, or careful analysis of the complex interrelationships of a global economy, or the other details of our disciplines, is ultimately inseparable from the way we approach God. Teaching is a much more sublime activity than we often recognize, and its performance is therefore fraught with the greatest significance. Whether we adopt as a guiding metaphor that of teaching as war, or teaching, more kind and gentle ones, like teaching as doctoring, teaching as apprenticeship, teaching as cultivating, and I think each of these is valuable and worthy of sustained reflection. Whatever metaphor we adopt, we must recognize the vital importance of envisioning our university community and our lives as teachers as forming what James K.A. Smith called a liturgical community. That is, whether we recognize it or not, we embody a community that is shaped by rhythms that are centered around what we love. The Christian university is an interwoven mesh of the concerns of both the heart and the mind. The rhythmic practices of the university foster or restrain habits of body and mind that ultimately are expressive of what we worship. All universities, even secular ones, according to Smith, are places of worship, even when they presume to be places dedicated to creating, locating, and transferring knowledge, that is, places of information. They are also places of deep formation of desires, habits, and character in pervasive and frequently unacknowledged ways. The issue is not whether worship is at the center of the university, but who is worshipped and what forms their worship takes, whether idolatrous or faithful ones. Our task at Lee University must be to recognize how what we do, The lectures we give, the dialectical exchange we foster in seminars, the books we read, the research we pursue, the engagements we conduct within our broader academic disciplines, the extracurricular activities we share with students and faculty, the meals we have together, the local congregations we participate in, the chapel and other worship services, as well as the concerts and theater productions we attend. All of this is expressive of certain liturgical priorities and rhythms which shape our lives, form our characters, intellectual as well as spiritual and moral, and ultimately contribute to or detract from the fulfillment of the end that we have set ourselves. Teaching is socialization. Teaching is habituation. Teaching is training in particular virtues. Teaching has a formative bearing upon worship, and indeed is an act of worship, and as such, it is an act of war. The stakes are thus far higher than we thought. I encourage you, as you advance into the uncertainties of a new semester, to think long and critically about the nature of teaching at a Christian liberal arts university, about the nature and identity of the intellectual virtues, about the means of instilling them in yourselves and your students, and about the metaphors that guide your lives and send you on your way towards the end to which you have been called. Do not, with a misplaced self-confidence, presume that you can go it alone, or that you will do well by unreflectively doing what comes naturally. Seek wisdom, and remember that the trite adoption of the latest technology or pedagogical technique rarely instills the deepest of intellectual virtues, and that the unexamined lecture is probably not worth giving. Fight the good fight, as 1 Timothy says, and never forget that you do not fight alone, for the battle is the Lord's.
Many thanks to Aaron for his, it's kind of a fun paradox to have a presentation on war be so constructive and edifying. Far from a quarrel or even a dialogue, what I'm moved to offer here is wholehearted agreement and a kind of application. I am a pacifist, and yet I have experienced teaching at Lee as a battleground. I feel more strongly on the front lines here than at any other time and place in my adult life. Aaron asked the question, who's our enemy, and asserts, I think rightly, that our enemy is the sin nature and all of the different powers in which it manifests. I don't ask what person or persons are my enemy. I name a particular manifestation of sin, a particular evil. And that is really great news. Nobody is my enemy. I can say that with faith and joy. But our enemy is evil wherever it is found. And as Solzhenitsyn reminds us, the line dividing good and evil cuts through every human heart. That is, our enemy is in everyone, and it is in ourselves. Every significant interaction with another person is a kind of fighting, not against that person, but against forces within that person. And as you can imagine, that line is really tricky to draw. Also, every significant interaction with another person is a kind of fighting against forces within ourselves. That's just a really scary model. Within myself at Lee, I fight a desire that C.S. Lewis calls the inner ring and illustrates as an academic vice in That Hideous Strength. The desire to be inside, not outside, particular groups, particular friendships, particular structures of power. The desire for acceptance and inclusion isn't bad in itself. Much of what I do at Lee is create communities, inner rings into which people can feel integrated enough to learn and belong. What's bad is treating an inner ring as a goal, not a means to a goal. And I think a particular temptation at Lee with student involvement and approval, such a heavy part of our job description, is to build a kind of inner ring of students and followers. It is a good feeling for me to look around, say, at my very small Chaucer class and realize every one of them has taken a class with me before, and they kind of want to have a second dose of learning. It's a good feeling to hear a student confide in me and just to realize in this conversation that I'm apparently someone that they'll come to if there's a problem. But that feeling makes a lousy goal. The most terrified moments I've had in these 3 years are when I realized that someone was following me, not on Twitter, in real life, down a path I'm marking for them, and that I was and am accountable to God for how I lead them. The jury is still out on whether following me is a good idea. Almost every student I know I've significantly influenced here has recently floundered and suffered, and that haunts me. So pushing past self-satisfaction can be a battle, but if we don't, it isn't just we who lose. At Lee, I also feel invited to help students fight two particular battles against themselves, and in this I think Aaron and I are thinking along a lot of the same lines. The first is the battle between desire and discipline. Some students don't care. Well, whatever. But some students care, but can't seem to follow through and live in defeat. One representative instance, a young man attended my freshman class faithfully, gave his oral presentation at the end of the semester, but didn't turn in a single writing assignment for this, a writing class. In some strange way, he cared, but not enough. These people have not learned the Augustinian lesson, Augustinian shout out, of how to prioritize their desires, how to follow the thread of a calling that they already sense through the many clamorous competing desires of college life, from work to social involvement, to a constellation of friendships, to budding romantic relationships, to role-playing games, to occasionally an already functional ministry. How to help them. And the story of my syllabi, which I'm back retelling, is the story of how I try to set up frameworks in which students can discipline a flickering intellectual desire, fan it against odds and cross-currents to flame. The second battle is the battle between autonomy and authority. I asked my capstone class what they wanted out of their Christian education. And one young woman wanted her Christian teachers to set the table of intellectual options impartially, from Christian to non-Christian, so that she could choose. The class kind of murmured agreement, and I just sort of goggled. I don't think I can do that. These people, desperate for someone to follow, which is very clear, desperate for some source to make sense of their lives, have either been so hurt by authority or so indoctrinated against it that it is difficult for them to consciously trust an outside source for things that really matter. They want to retain agency at all costs. The tricky thing here is that a frontal authoritative assault is exactly the way to scare them off, shy them away. I'm trying to learn how to fight pedagogically like Jesus did, how to go on the offensive, not by attacking, but by dying.
When Aaron sent it to me on Tuesday, I realized that I'll sound as his echo. So instead of doing that, I decided to look at some theological aspects of the vocation of the Christian university. And overall, while the theme of spiritual warfare has preoccupied much of contemporary evangelical spirituality, my pacifist theological imagination still feels a bit uneasy with that topic of teaching as war, and naturally tends towards looking for other appropriate metaphors. And so I'll be looking a little bit at other appropriate metaphors to expound the dialogue. And this is not to deny or understate the reality of spiritual warfare and the legitimacy of its scriptural articulation, nor the usefulness of this metaphor in the vocation of the Christian pedagogian. No doubt, as Christian community of pedagogians and scholars, we should be involved in an ongoing process of discerning the spirits that seek to find their incarnation in the lives of our students, competing for their hearts and minds, for their attention, and shaping their moral imagination and worldview. in its complex reality, redemption is experienced, among other things, also as liberation from the rule of the spirits of the present age and surrender to the guidance of the Holy Spirit in one's life. Thus, in its essence, redemption is a profoundly countercultural experience that negates many of the values which have formed Western culture, for example. The Spirit of God, in contrast to the spirits of the age, seeks to incarnate Christ within the community of faith until it becomes a living extension of the Lord in the world. This process of Christoformation through the agency of the Spirit is marked with a continual need for ascesis and kenosis, for or fasting from ourselves and seeking to put our lives in the lives of others so that they may flourish. This procession towards the likeness of God presupposes the development of a covenantal communal consciousness that takes responsibility for the well-being of the other person and the rest of creation. And here to echo what was already shared by Aaron and Chuck, therefore, in order to form this Christ-like consciousness, teaching, Christ-centered teaching, has to be engaged in retraining the affections, reorienting them towards God. Because after all, as I say to my theology students, we worship what we love, and we become what we worship. And it involves also taking responsibility for the condition of the world, which we know as called repentance. This is what repentance is, taking a responsibility for the condition of the world. So there cannot be a transformation of the world without that act of responsibility taking. Instead of externalizing evil and scapegoating the other, we have to see this struggle for the transfiguring of the world as originating within us. Okay. This Christ-like consciousness, which I believe the Christian university should strive to develop in its students, is contrary to the flow of Western culture and offers an antidote to the idolization of individualism and material prosperity, which leads towards the erosion of communal bonds and comprehensive commodification of life in the liturgy of unrestrained consumerism. These indeed are some of the fundamental forces, as Aaron pointed out, against which Christian teachers have to take a stand in the classroom today. The peculiar challenge of the Christian university, however, is finding a way to flourish in this world while working for the advent of a different one, through nurturing, in effect, cultural and intellectual dissidents who long for and work towards the transformation of the present into the kingdom of God. Ironically, we have to survive amidst the savage competition of the market. We were reminded about that yesterday in our seminars, yet negate its very essence through our teaching. And can we do so with integrity when we have adopted market criteria for our self-evaluation as successful pedagogians? And the market keeps pressing us in that direction. Being in this world yet not of it is one of the long-lasting struggles of Christian spirituality. This challenge is consistent with the unique tension within the very dialectic of social change. The embracing of the novel in the present embodies in itself the end of the present. Thus, change is always terrifying and instinctively resisted. Yet we cannot change the world unless we change ourselves. While I agree with Aaron that cultural adaptations could render Christianity irrelevant and tame its potential to transfigure the world, there is something to be said here about the reality of the incarnation, of God taking upon himself the totality of humanness, including culture, in order to redeem it. Not only because only what has been recapitulated in the Son of God, that is the Son of Man, can be redeemed. Only that is a subject to redemption. So God takes upon himself both the universality and particularity of culture without fear of becoming contaminated by it. And indeed, fighting the students' technology-induced attention deficit with more technology seems to be a questionable solution. Yet the genius of the incarnation joins the medium of the age, of its age, of this age, of the present age, and the eternal message that births the world and heals the world in a redemptive oneness. This is something to ponder upon. Alvin Toffler defines change as the future invading the present. Indeed, world-changing is an appropriate metaphor for our vocation as Christian teachers. It's one of my favorite. Yet, in difference of secular programs for social transformation, we know that it takes the word to heal and transfigure a broken and fractured world. The prologue of John's Gospel, as well as the book of Genesis, of course, remind us that the Word is in the fibers of the world, that the world is a materialized Word, that everything that exists proceeds from the Word, and as we discover in the book of Revelation, is destined to be summoned back in the incarnate Word, Jesus Christ, until He becomes all in all. One of the scriptural visions of cosmic redemption is depicted as the knowledge of God filling the entire world, covering it as the waters of the sea. I was thrilled to see Aaron's reference to John Milton. The Christian University is in the business of healing the cosmos. Indeed, it takes Christ-likeness to mend the cosmos, the Word of God, yet always incarnate, therefore embodied in a human community, healing the relationships of one human being to another and the rest of the world. Therefore, the liturgical rhythm of Christ-centered teaching is engaged in healing and mending the world through transforming and empowering the students' socio-political and moral imagination to envision and embody the future of God in the midst of the present. As Aaron pointed out, regardless of our choice of metaphor, Christ-centered teaching is an act of worship. More particularly, for me, it is a sacrament, a means of communion between us, our students, and God, in which the divine presence transfigures the world into its very future. While our students, groomed by the forces of this age, often enter the classroom with the selfish goal to find the fastest shortcut to a diploma and a larger check, we have the difficult task to enchant them with the sacrament of learning for the sake of the world's future, to infect them with the wonder of discovery, the empowerment of illumination, and the beauty of knowledge as rewards in themselves, and to convince them that excellence, these virtues that we need to cultivate in them, is an act of worship and therefore can never be a subject to compromise or to negotiation. For after all, they're studying not for their own sake, but so that the world may live and live life more abundant. For as I often quote Saint Irenaeus to my students, he said, the glory of God is every creature fully alive. And that is the purpose of the Christian University.
Thank you to my respondents. That was awesome.
Okay, so autonomy versus authority, Chad. Do I yield to their hunger for increased exposure and connectedness and technology with each other? Or do I yield to my desire to impress upon them, the importance of taking upon themselves the responsibility of lifelong learning and investigation of their own role in their professional communities?
Can I respond instead
Please.
of you? I would just say that the teacher who told you, as they told me in graduate school and undergraduate, that they just want me to think for myself, was in fact practicing a very subtle form of self-deception. They want me to think exactly like them. And by saying that you don't need any authority figure, they are participating in a very large philosophical project that has been going on for a couple centuries now. But they are practicing the delusion that by their saying these sorts of things, they are in fact withdrawing themselves as authority figures, when in fact that's just not true. They want you to think like them. And they will let you know when you think poorly in a seminar, while at the same time using the rhetoric of thinking for yourself. So I think I want my students to take, this isn't what you meant maybe, but I want my students to take responsibility for themselves, right? But I don't think that I can, with any sort of academic integrity or personal honesty, say, I'm going to be hands-off and let them draw the conclusions that they want, and so on. And if I don't take seriously my task of forming them, somebody else already has. They have already they've always already been formed when they come here, which is why I think war is an appropriate metaphor, because we're fighting against big forces that we don't even know have shaped us, too, at the same time.
I was going to say, because that comes out of this conversation in Capstone where this class kind of said, we want the power to choose. And I said, so manipulation is always bad, right? And they were very emphatic, that's true. And I said, I manipulate you all the time. You know, I mean, this syllabus constitutes an argument that I really hope you'll follow. And it was, yeah, I mean, it was, they want to be argued. They want to know it, but it's all very tricky how you frame it. Yeah.
But the very fact that they said, I want to be a free agent with free choice to choose between multiple options means they've already been formed by a market metaphor.
Absolutely.
I mean, when they show up, they've already been formed by certain metaphors, and they don't even realize it. They think they're being objective.
But at the same time, it takes, if we deny them the opportunity for non-conformism, it means that we function precisely as the market in their lives. So it takes a great deal of intentionality and struggle with ourselves as pedagogians in order to nurture this non-conformism, even dissidency, allow them to develop their own intellectual identity, and still be good guides for them. It is a very, I think this is an enormous burden for me particularly. Yeah? Because after all, we do not want to suppress what their unique contribution to the process of forming and shaping the world. Yeah. We don't want to clone them.
I mean, we must approach this with all due humility. If that's really what's going on, we're forming them whether we know it or not, whether we say it or not, then that becomes very scary. And I mean, this is what Chad said. We're walking people down roads, even when we deny it. That is a huge amount of responsibility suddenly that I certainly don't want to carry, but it's too late. I'm here and I'm carrying it. Right. Yeah.
I'm on a different topic. I'm not.
Oh, yeah,
okay.
You can switch topic.
The word professor is such a great combination of humbleness and authority. We profess daily. We profess Christ.
You can switch.
Okay. Well, I have like 15 different things floating around, so I will attempt to make some sense out of something. But I'm just struck by, again, the war metaphor and just thinking about, in a sense, kind of like the Christian life. If it's easy all the time and we're kind of complacent, then there's something's not right there, right? And I'm thinking about the role as a teacher. If it's, in a sense, from what you're saying, it should be difficult. It should be incredibly difficult. And I'm just thinking about with the market culture and values, and maybe even a temptation to be entertaining in the classroom. And I don't have a problem with. I mean, I think I think learning should be full of joy and delight and all kinds of things. But pure entertainment is the opposite of attentiveness. I feel it's just kind of mindless. It can be mindless consumption. And I think we have to be very careful how we model, the way we teach, and we have to model attentiveness. And I guess I do have a little problem with the complete demonization of technology, because I think maybe we need to model attentiveness towards the very world that has formed our students, that they need to learn to read their own culture. And I think there needs some redemptive aspects of that. But my question is, yes, we need to kind of model this attentiveness to text. I totally agree, and I think that's a huge, that's something that most of the students come in completely not knowing how to use analytical skills on their culture, on text in front of them. But in the classroom, I guess after all that, my question is, in the classroom, how do we turn that attentiveness? In what way do we model even in the way the kind of public discourse, the kind of back and forth with the students? Because I feel like I want my students to care about a text, not just because it's a bunch of data to consume, but because there's a relationship there between the creator who's behind it, the human author who's created it. So how do I also, in what way does that attentiveness, that relationship also play out in the classroom, if you see what I mean. That's a huge, I'm just thinking through, because it's not just about attentiveness to a text, it's also attentiveness to other human beings
Right.
in a learning
Right.
environment. So I don't know, that's kind of vague, but I'm just wondering about just the pedagogy of how does that act it out. It's not just about the text, but it's also about our interaction with these individuals as we are kind of guiding them in learning to read, basically, their culture and themselves. So any comments on?
I mean, I wanted to do something like that, but the issue is that this happens with every single content piece of every lecture or every issue that's discussed in a seminar. So it's really hard to say. I mean, if we're reading through Homer's Iliad and we're talking about this, even in a lecture format, I can say, well, what are the main issues driving the poem, etc. We can finally get to the end, and we can talk about characterization of Achilles or something like this. But at the end of the day, ultimately, a shallow reading is going to ignore certain fundamental details that are ignored in the general textbook approaches. And in fact, the way I teach it now is, the way I teach the Iliad, for instance, now, is a conglomeration of things that students have taught me over the years. Almost none of what I used to have in my lecture notes for how the Iliad ought to be read, why it matters, whether there's a historical kernel behind it, all that stuff has now fallen by the wayside because of things students have taught me. But it hinges on very particular details. The use of a particular simile at a particular place in the plot. The very final word of the entire Iliad, for instance, is an aha moment for the interpretation of the entire thing that people often overlook. So it's even word placement, etc. That's in a poem, but if I'm in a biology class, it's going to be something different, right? There will be a different text, a cell, let's say, or a problem of genes or something like this, and then the details are going to look different in that. In a theological issue, the details are going to look different. That's why it's hard to just pick an example and say, oh, well, this word. I mean, every single thing we ought to be focused. If Simone Bay is right, and I just startlingly, I was looking, I'm going to a conference at Calvin College on intellectual virtues. There's a whole bunch of panels, it turns out, on attentiveness, and they're all turned to this essay by Simone Bay. It's in her Waiting for God, this well-known book. But it's something, I don't remember the title, even if it's on a footnote somewhere here. But in any case, suddenly this matters for every single little, and all of her examples are like geometry and math. And she says these have eternal consequences. The student doesn't know it, and we often fail to recognize it, but they do. Because we're training in attentiveness, which is what prayer is all about. Which is why it is goofy, I think. I mean, that we want to distract people so much in the classroom sometimes, and then we want to distract them in worship services sometimes, too. I mean, it's rather ironic. I don't want to demonize technology. I use technology all the time. But there are challenges and pitfalls of every technique or every piece of technology.
Using technology as an end of itself,
right,
or as just a mode of entertainment is
right,
just perpetuating the problem, isn't it?
right. So anyway, Tom.
Based on the discussion in the preview, having teaching is more sort of deconstruction and reconstruction to deconstruct the vice within ourselves and within our students, or at least the misapprehension of a Christian worldview and an understanding of the role as an educated individual. It seems like that takes attentiveness and patience and time such that foundational skills would be extremely important, and it would be done over successive classes and a curriculum that builds such that condensing the educating process in any way, be it smaller chunks, would be complicated, particularly it's the importance of re-education, I suppose. So how does that kind of play in terms of, we spend a lot of time with students inside and outside the classroom. I think the exposure to students outside the classroom adds to the curriculum that we give them, right? So we can model many of the lessons through our own lives outside the classroom and encourage outside reading. But thoughts on curriculum and that kind of thing?
I was hoping that possibly the direction for this year that the conversations take with the CTE would do just that. I mean, when I have one set of goals. When I think in my head, I have one set of goals for my core classes that everybody at the university has to take. I will probably never see most of them again in a classroom setting. And then I have a different set of goals, or at least a higher level of attentiveness to different sorts of details, engagement with scholarship that has been haggling over the attentiveness to which details, and et cetera. I'll just be doing that at a higher level. But I would hope that I would be able to make some sort of impact in the core class. And I think if more people teaching core classes were thinking along those lines, that would be a great thing. But so often, I mean, like I said the other day, I mean, I just suddenly stumbled into, it's a complete embarrassment of mine, that I've always focused on how can I deliver this content better. And, well, I know that they will forget what they heard today, so what do I want them to get out of it? And I've never spoken of this in terms of intellectual virtue, that is guiding a person towards a particular character that fulfills a particular telos. I mean, this is the Aristotelian way to talk about the virtues, but I would like extended, sustained conversation by lots of us about that.
May I add something? And actually it goes back to Mary's question as well, and to yours, Tom. I believe that here James Smith, Designing the Kingdom, would be very helpful. Reaching for the career, for bringing them into a liturgical training of their affections, creating new rhythms of their life. And as you remember, maybe if you have read the book, there is an entire section on the liturgy of the university that will be incredibly helpful. And he points out that the fundamental retraining of affections actually happens outside of the classroom. We may give intellectual stimulation in the classroom, but the liturgical rhythm of the university encompasses so much more. And if we look at the ratio in which the students spend of time that they spend in the classroom and outside of the classroom on this campus, we will see how much weightier is this time that they spend elsewhere. So for me, it will not be so much in the essence of structuring the curriculum, though that is important. It has to be continually visited. At least Sachs wants it from us. If for no other reason, we have to do it. But how do we intentionally form and shape all of the rest of the university life towards this goal? Because this is where ultimately the fundamental investment of their time will go. And how we make that not just entertainment, not a flirt, not a waste of their time, but actually a profoundly forming and shaping experience of their affections, of their desires, so that they may ultimately develop such a taste for the kingdom, such a desire for the kingdom, that nothing else can satisfy.
I'm sorry to say that we're officially